This is Dr. Eric Morrow. Welcome to this edition of On Politics. We're glad you're joining us today right here on KTRL FM 90.5, and we are continuing our series and focusing on different elements or aspects of our society, of the world around us, related to the impact of the COVID-19 crisis. As you know, we've looked at public education, we've looked at economic issues here in Stephenville and throughout the region. We've looked at public health, and we continue this as we did last week at looking at the primary and convention process in the state of Texas, especially since we're in a general election cycle, and how this crisis has impacted that process. And so we want to welcome, and joining us today, we're very glad to have you, Mr. Gilberto Hinojosa, who is the chairman of the Texas Democratic Party. And I understand, Mr. Hinojosa, and looking at your bio, that you've been in this position for almost 9 years now. And so you've seen, I know, a tremendous amount of change and transition given the general election cycles and even the state election cycles that we've been through. So I want to welcome you today. You are a former judge in Cameron County. You were in Cameron County's government from 1995 to 2006. You've had experience at different aspects of the party, both at the state and national level. And we just want to welcome you today. Thank you for joining us. I wanted to first question I really wanted to ask was, and this comes from my experience of teaching state and local government here to college students in Texas, but really seeing how that most students and really a lot of people just do not understand the primary and convention process. They some people they go vote in a primary. They think they're selecting the candidates, and in a way they are, that are going on the ballot for the general election. But there's a lot more to it than that, especially in determining if there's runoff elections, or as well the party platform, and trying to look at how that platform will be developed, as well as how the party will be represented at the national level when we're in a presidential election cycle. Could you give us a little insight into really how that process works and what happens from the primary on to the state convention?
Well, the primary election ends up electing our nominees, whoever's going to run under the Democratic ticket in November for the positions that are considered to be partisan positions, the legislature, judges, different offices in county government like county judges, county commissioners, and statewide officials, the governor, the U.S. senators, congressmen and women. They're elected in the primary. Texas is a southern state, so it's Texas is a southern state, is required to have a person, in order to get a nomination for an office, it has to get more than 50% of the vote. So if you don't have 50% of the vote, and by the way, this is unlike most states in the north, which is the top vote getter is the nominee. But here in the state of Texas, as in most southern states, you got to get 51% of the vote, 50 plus 1% of the vote in order to be the nominee. So if you don't get it in the primary, you have to do a runoff, and usually it takes a couple of months to have a runoff after the primary election, primarily because Texas has a law that allows for servicemen and servicewomen to be able to vote. So there has to be enough lead time to get them a ballot and to have them return the ballot in order to be able to have them have access to voting on a runoff. Anyway, once that happens, then we lead into the state convention. Now, what the purpose of the state convention is different in gubernatorial election years from presidential election years. In presidential election years, which is where we're at right now, it has a lot of the similar functions, but some additional functions that are very important for purposes of, especially nowadays when these presidential elections are not as clear cut early on as what you saw this time around in this primary for the presidency. So normally what a state convention does is you path of platform. The platform is what the party stands for. Where we stand on all the issues that are important to Americans. The issue of economic issues, some social issues, whether or not a woman has a right to choose what to do with her body, positions on marriage equality, minimum wage, support for the right to collectively bargain, and so on and so forth. Issues that are important to working men and women and families all across the state of Texas, education, healthcare, and so forth. We also entertain and pass resolutions on issues outside of the platform. A lot of them very similar to what's in the platform, but some of them are different. That happens both in gubernatorial election years and presidential election years. We also elect at the state conventions on both gubernatorial and presidential election years the executive committee of the Democratic Party, who runs the party all year long, all the time. So every 2 years we have elections for a committee made up of a man and a woman from each senatorial district in the state of Texas. And then there's caucuses that are part of the Democratic Party that have also members in the executive committee, and those caucuses meet during the conventions, and they also elect persons to be on the executive committee. And there's other business that's entertained. We have our gubernatorial candidates in gubernatorial election year, and other statewide candidates that have already been nominated, and it's a rah-rah time to hear them, to get people excited, to get ready for the election in November. In presidential election years, there's an additional factor that comes into play, and that is we have to elect the delegates to the national convention. And those delegates in Texas, under the recent rules that are passed by the Democratic National Committee, are selected based on two criteria. They're selected based upon how many people voted in a senatorial district in the preceding election. That's how you determine how many delegates are assigned to each senatorial district in the state of Texas. And you have to select delegates according to the presidential preference. So let's say in the presidential election, you had this, I don't remember what the numbers were, but if Joe Biden got 48% of the vote and Bernie Sanders got 35% of the vote, or something to that effect, then the delegates are allocated to each presidential candidate based upon the percentage that it ultimately ends up, because there's a lot of people that dropped out prior to the time that you have the national convention. So you reallocate some of those positions for people that didn't meet a threshold. And once you determine that threshold, once people determine whether someone reached the threshold, then you can assign delegates. And in other words, if after the allocation is made, there's supposed to be, let's say, 52 or 53% of the delegates have to be Joe Biden delegates, and let's say 42 or 43 have to be Bernie Sanders delegates, and then the rest of them Bloomberg delegates. That's who is elected. Whoever runs for delegate has to be running for those particular positions. Once those are selected at the state convention, that's who is allowed to go along with alternates to the national convention. And then we also, we pass resolutions that go and are presented to the national convention as well. We also select the elector, the presidential elector, the people that will actually cast a ballot. One of the 38 electoral votes in the state of Texas. Texas, as well as most of the states in the country, has got a system based on the electoral college that whoever wins the majority of votes, or not the majority, the plurality of votes in a state gets all the electoral votes from that particular state. So all that issue. So it's a pro forma role to be an elector, but a lot of people want to be in a position where, for the first time in 40 years, they'll be able to vote for a Democrat for president of the United States, because it hadn't happened in a long time. So that's essentially the way the convention process. Normally, every 2 years we have a convention at a location where we Texas has the largest state convention in the country. The only
Hmm.
other larger convention than ours is the Democratic National Convention. We have a convention that we have anywhere between 8 to 10, sometimes even more delegates coming to the convention. So it's a huge event to produce. And we were going to have one this time around in San Antonio, but because of the coronavirus pandemic, the city of San Antonio uh, uh, put us in the position where we had to cancel our in-person convention. So right now we're planning for a virtual convention. It'll be the first in the nation. It's a massive project that we started about 6 weeks ago. And I think it's going to be a production that is going to be handle a lot of the business of the party in a different way, in some respects, in a much more effective way, in an efficient way. In some respects, we're not going to have what you'd like to have, which is that pep rally before the football game,
Hmm.
right?
Right.
And
Right.
I played football in high school, and our games were always on Friday nights. We'd have a pep rally on Friday afternoon at school, and everybody would get pumped up for the game. We're not going to have that. We're going to have to get our team pumped up, in other non-traditional ways as Labor Day comes around. But we're ready for this, and we'll make the best of this situation. And obviously, the most important thing is that people are safe, and they're not exposed to any disease. That we're going to need them to continue to support their families and enjoy this American way of life that we have today. So
Well,
that's a
that's a tremendous.
nutshell.
Sure, sure, yeah, and that's great. I mean, that is very helpful in understanding that process, and then too transitioning to see what the impact has been of the COVID-19 crisis, and especially on a convention. I mean, yes, Texas is known for these large party conventions that bring people from all over the state together, and there's that element of having people there with political leaders, party leaders, in order to, like you said, get everyone ready for the push to the national election. What are other areas that you see? I mean, you talked about 6 weeks to move a very large convention into a virtual platform. We were able to have a Super Tuesday and have the primary elections, but what other impacts do you see here? I mean, I know one for certainly is campaigning. I mean, this has really changed the dynamics of campaigning, and I didn't know how the state party is addressing that and helping and guiding candidates in that area.
Well, it's a planning process that depends upon a lot of things, and so we have to have contingency plans based upon where we are ultimately in the fall. I mean, we have a runoff that got postponed from May until July, and so right now it's safe to say that July will still probably to a large extent be in this crisis. There probably will be a lot of social distancing still going on, and a lot of people will probably not want to show up and vote in person. And so the party has been advocating very strongly for a vote by mail program,
Mhm.
not to force everybody to vote by mail, but to give everybody that option. Texas is a very strange state when it comes to voting. We discourage people from voting. We don't encourage people from voting. We discourage people from registering to vote. We discourage people from organizing to register to people to vote. Most states allow voters to vote to register online. Most states allow voter registration campaigns to go the way they need to go. With respect to voting, most states allow anybody that wants to vote for mail to be permitted to vote by mail. A few states are like Texas, where in order for you to be able to qualify on voting by mail, you have to meet certain specific categories, and there are criminal consequences if you violate those
Mhm.
criteria. For example, or if you encourage people to violate that criteria. In Texas, in order for you to vote by mail, you have to be over the age of 65. You have to be a person who is not going to be in your district or your county on election day. It's got to be someone prisoner, who's going to be in prison, or it's got to be somebody that has a disability if you went to go vote, that prevents you from going to vote, or if voting would cause you physical harm. So initially, the Secretary of State's office said, well, we're going to let each county interpret it the way they want to interpret that. And that created a lot of confusion. So when we went to the Republican Party and said, look, let's agree that we will approach the governor's office, say anybody that is fearful of contracting COVID-19 at the polling place when they go vote in person should have the option to vote by mail. What's wrong with that? It's a nonpartisan issue. There's just as many people who, the coronavirus doesn't distinguish between Democrats and Republicans. Right. If you're going to contract that virus, it doesn't matter who you are. And so if there's a high degree of danger that in a polling place, when you show up in a polling place, that you're going to contract that virus, and no human beings that haven't gotten it are immune from it. So that means there's a good chance that you can, by attending the polling place and actually voting, you can endanger your life. And so we asked whether they would be in agreement to encourage the governor to allow that. They said no. So then we went to the governor's office, and they said no. So we filed a lawsuit in Travis County and had a trial, and we put on witnesses. Epidemiologists testified, doctors testified that said this is something that people can get by showing up at a polling place, and the varying degrees of harm to individuals, and showing up at these polling places will expose you to that virus, and you can take it home as well and expose the rest of your family to it. And contrary to what Republicans were saying, if you vote by mail, that ballot's not going to have the coronavirus by the time it reaches the elected officials. Anyway, we put on the evidence. The district judge heard it, and Travis County agreed with us and entered an injunction. Simultaneously with entering in that injunction, the Attorney General of the state of Texas issued a advisory opinion, or I think that's what it was. It was not a formal opinion from the Attorney General's office, an advisory opinion where he disagreed with the judge and threatened to prosecute anybody in the state of Texas that advised a person to vote by mail if they were fearing contracting COVID-19 if they went to vote in person. So that's kind of where we were at this time. We also filed a parallel lawsuit in federal court in San Antonio, where our position is, and it's consistent, we believe, with what the truth where facts are right now. In Texas, if you take the right to vote, or the national right to vote, under the 26th Amendment to the United States Constitution, anybody over the age of 18 has a constitutional right to vote, right? So, but what happens because of coronavirus, because COVID-19, that has now come to a different situation. Anybody over the age of 18 that is fearful of going to vote in person, unless they're over the age of 65, cannot vote, because the state of Texas has said, we're not going to recognize the fear of exposure to COVID-19 as a disability entitling you to vote by mail. And so our position is that violates the constitutional right to vote, because you can vote if you're over the age of 65. You don't have to give a reason. You don't have to be fearful. You just don't vote. You just vote by mail. But if you're under the age of 65, and like you and I'm not going to go vote in person because I don't want to get sick. I'm actually over the age of 65, and I could vote by mail. But if I was under the age of 65, I wouldn't go vote, because I'm not going to expose myself and my family to that. That means I'm being deprived of my constitutional right to vote. The other factor that's involved there as well is that if you take Texans, and you take the demographics of Texans, Demographically, there are more Anglo or white people over the age of 65 percentage wise than the population as a whole. And so what happens essentially is that by prohibiting people under the age of 65 from voting by mail, you are having a disproportionate impact on Hispanics, African Americans, and other minorities, and depriving them of their right to vote in a disproportional way, such that it violates their 14th Amendment to their 14th Amendment rights to equal justice, as well as, equal justice, as well as their right, their constitutional right to vote. So that lawsuit's pending in federal court. When right before we filed that, the Attorney General came, because what happened after we got our injunction, the Harris County election officials, Dallas County election officials, Bexar County election, of all the big, large cities and counties in the state of Texas said they were going to allow people to vote by mail if they were in fear of contracting COVID-19 at the polling place. And the Attorney General again issued a threat. He sent out an email to all election officials in the state of Texas stating that he would prosecute anybody that advised people that if they voted by mail because they were fearful of contracting COVID-19, that he would prosecute them under the criminal laws of the state of Texas. So that's where we're at right now. We're asking for an injunction against him as well in the federal court in San Antonio.
Well, depending on how this works out, and if mail voting, voting by mail is an option, we've seen this in other states. We've seen where, of course, we have a lot bigger electorate, sometimes 3 or 4 times some of the sizes of the other states. But what do you see or maybe other options in addition to voting by mail as we move to the general election? I mean, you look at this time. Some are saying that flu season, we may have a resurgence of the virus, and that's going to be very critical. One is, you see a few people here and there say, well, maybe we need to reconsider that. I don't see a large call for changing or postponing something that's very much a part of who we are as a country. Our elections are really sacred to us in terms of our right to vote. Has there been any other discussions or ideas put forward, or do you see anything out there that would say, hey, there's different ways that we can try to handle this to make sure that people are able to vote on election day?
We have never in the history of the United States postponed an election.
Right.
Never. In a general election. During the middle of the Civil War, the general, I can't remember what his name was, that had been the commanding general for the Union forces, had been fired by Abraham Lincoln. And he decided to run for the Democratic nomination and was the Democratic nominee for president of the United States against President Lincoln. And the prevailing wisdom out there, because people were tired of the war, was that he was probably going to beat Lincoln. And the entire nation was in a civil war. I mean, imagine this, a civil war where we are having brother against brother fighting each other all over the country. Martial law was in place all over the country. It would have been a perfect example, a perfect situation where Abraham Lincoln could have said, well, look, this is not going to be a good way to conduct an election in the middle of a civil war. And he refused to do that. He made a decision that no matter what, there was nothing more important than preserving our democracy and what we stand for and a person's right to elect their leaders. And even if it meant him losing, then that, so be it, was the way it was going to go. We had a similar pandemic or a plague with the Spanish flu. The election was not postponed. In World War I, the election was not postponed. We were in a world war in the 1940s, and the election was not postponed. And so there is no history for that to happen. What we should be doing is making sure that people have a constitutional right to vote. You know, at the end of the day, if the Republican Attorney General and the governor of this state refuse to allow people to exercise the right to vote by mail, we're going to figure it out. we're going to do something. We're going to make sure that people find a way to vote. If we have to have, lines of vehicles and doing drive-by voting all over the state of Texas, and people can show up and vote like that, that's what we're going to do. We have contingency plans in the party to do any of a number of different options in making sure people exercise the right to vote. Whether it's a vote by mail program that would be massive, whether it's a drive-by voting program, where it's some kind of program where people minimize the risk to themselves and to their family, we're going to do it because that's just what we think is what has to happen. And hopefully, and what's even more, I think, dramatic today is this: all predictions in the state of Texas were that this was going to be the largest turnout election in the history of the state of Texas.
Right.
We're going to have huge numbers of people voting this election. And if you layer on that the fact that the Republican governor and legislature eliminated straight ticket voting, which means that in large counties like Harris County and Dallas County, where you have 40 or 45 judges on the ballot, you're going to have ballots that are going to be 3 pages long or longer, or 4 pages long, with something like 70 or more positions on the ballot, where people now cannot vote straight ticket, have to go to the polling place and vote 70 or 65 positions on the ballot, one by one. How long are those lines going to be? If you're social distancing, 6 feet away, you're going to have a mile-long line, right? People voting. And the amount of time that it's going to take for people to vote is not going to be 30 minutes or 45 minutes. It's going to be 3 or 4 hours at a time. That affects our democracy as well. I mean, it makes no sense then that this is happening. But if this is the way the Republican Party wants to do this, then so be it. Then we will fight that fight in the only way we know how, which is we will organize, and organize.
I think part of it too is a call here for awareness, which is a lot of what we do on this show, is providing information and just trying to alert people to be aware and looking at things that we may need a lot of election personnel. I mean, it's one of those things where in order to process some of this, whether it is by mail or it's by a combination or it's by driving by precinct locations, it seems like there's definitely going to be a demand here for people really to step up and volunteer and work with local election officials to make this work at all. I mean, otherwise we're going to see those scenarios like you're saying, where you have people waiting for hours and hours to vote, not knowing what the weather or what we have to do related to the pandemic. It just seems like a need for people really to put their support behind a basic right that we have, and to make sure that people are able to participate to the full extent in this election.
Well, and that's the other factor that I don't understand how this is going to be handled. There is a big problem with respect to election officials, who's going to run the election. Historically, the people who run elections are retirees, elderly people who do this on the side. In Dallas, I think it was in Dallas County. In Dallas County, they normally recruit somewhere between 300 or so election officials for the runoff election, or a lot more than that. But by now, we'd have about 300. They had only been able to recruit something like 65 or 70 up to now. They're short several hundred election officials because no one is afraid. The Wisconsin election that happened about 3 weeks ago, they've already started getting numbers of election officials who contracted COVID-19 while they were conducting the election, on top of a lot of voters who got it as well. So this has ramifications all over the place. I mean, if you don't have people, able to administer the election. Well, how do you conduct an election?
Right, right. Do you think this is a case? And this was just came up in conversations with my wife this past week of talking about these kinds of issues. And I mean, are we at the point that we need to consider an election holiday in order to be able to get the ranks of people, my age. I mean, I'm in my early 50s, but it seems like we need a lot more people engaged this year, no matter what the process is. I know you're advocating for more voting by mail, and even if we had a mixture or one or the other, it just seems to me that there's going to be a requirement to have more people. The risk to our senior citizens who, like you're right, every time I go to vote, it's the retirees who are there every time. Sometimes the same people every year after year who are manning those precinct sites to make sure that the election happens. I just to me, it just seems like we've got to be ready for a lot of different possibilities.
Well, yeah, I mean, they're the most vulnerable, as we all know.
Right.
You know, our election laws were created 250 years ago. The reason why we vote on the first Tuesday of November,
Right.
on even every 4 years, on even election years, is because we lived in an agricultural society in
Mm-hmm.
the year 1776, and when the Constitution passed, and so most farmers were not in season in the first Tuesday. They didn't have to be harvesting their crops. They didn't have to be planting their crops. They had this little period of time for a couple of months when they did not have the urgency of the work that was required for farmers during that period of time. So they set these elections at that time.
Mm-hmm.
We are no longer an agricultural society. It makes no sense that we have an election on a Tuesday as opposed to a Saturday. It makes no sense that we don't give everybody the day off to go out and vote. I mean, we discourage people from participating, not encourage them. We make it hard for them for voting instead of making it easy for them to vote. And to this day, I just don't understand why that mentality exists in this country, particularly in the state. In the state, it's really hard to get people to understand that, this is our most important, most fundamental right that we have to elect the leaders. We should make it easy for people to participate so that they can want to go vote instead of scaring them, making it hard for them, make it complicated for them. All the things that are in place today is one of the reasons why Texas has the lowest voter turnout of any state in the country.
Right. Yes, we talk about that at length in our classes and pointing out, especially when you move to those off-year elections when we're voting on constitutional amendments. That one's always one that is interesting to get into dialogue with students about, saying, do you actually know we have an election and it's just on constitutional amendments? But some of those things go back to those kind of norms that have gotten locked into place that become so very hard to change because there's just not the political will, it seems like, in the state to do that. I'm big on constitutional reform, of seeing the need for so many things, our revenue system and other areas. But talking about change, I mean, we've seen this attention given to Texas for a number of years now about the shift in party identification. There's been all these predictions in the past decade over Texas turning purple and then blue, and looking at the growth in the Latino population in the state, and so it's for me as someone who looks at this and teaches it. I realize it's much more complex than just a straight demographic transition. There's a lot more things happening. You've been involved in this for almost a decade now, and even longer in your just in the roles that you've had. But as chair of the Democratic Party, where do you see things happening? What are kind of the dynamic changes that are going on in the state that are related to the Democratic Party, and where do you see some of this going in the future?
Well, I think that when I first took over the party in 2012, um, the issue for the Democrats was, we have a large Hispanic population. Half the people in the state are Hispanic. With African Americans and Asian Americans, it's a majority minority state. Every majority minority state in the country is run by Democrats today. Why wasn't it in Texas? And the reason primarily in Texas was because Hispanics have very low turnout, and that's a product of economic factors and educational factors. I mean, any ethnic group that is a lower level economically, lower level educationally, will vote at lower levels. That's just the way it works, and that's where Hispanics are at in Texas. I think probably the exception to that rule are African Americans, because they had a 75-year history where their number one issue was achieving civil rights by winning in the polling places, getting people to register to vote, getting them to go out and vote. And they had a 75-year civil rights movement that's all they focused on. And so today in African American communities, that's a big issue. I mean, you've heard souls to the polls, African American churches emptying out on Sundays and going to vote early. And so you have in some places a higher turnout in African American communities than you have in Anglo American communities. But that hasn't kind of taken hold with Hispanics. And so our effort has always been to increase voter turnout, increase voter registration, do engagement programs, getting Latinos to understand that voting is not only important for themselves, but for their families. And we've had moderate success in that. Places like Houston, Harris County, where we've had, almost 1 million people registered to vote, most of them Hispanics in the last 3 or 4 years, and continue to do that. But you still along the border have low voter turnout in Latino communities. What's happened in Texas is a little bit different, though, where we have had major demographic changes in Texas that has changed the political landscape of this state has been in the suburbs. In the suburbs of Texas, outside of Houston, Travis County, or Austin, and the DFW area, has been huge numbers of people moving into these suburban communities from the East Coast and from the West Coast. People who were not traditionally people that automatically voted for, Republicans that had that knee-jerk reaction to partisan politics. They were coming in with either an open mind, not necessarily a Democrat or Republican, or they were coming in with a Democratic Party frame of mind. They consistently voted for Democrats in the states that they came from: California, New York, New Jersey, up the East Coast, and they moved to Texas in large numbers in these suburban areas. And when they started participating in elections, they were looking at things either more objectively or more leaning towards Democrats. And that's what you've seen in terms of the changes and why we've been able to achieve a lot more success in the last 4 or 5 years, 6 years in the past. We're much more organized than we were before, and I think the National Party has focused a lot more in Texas in the last few years. I mean, we are receiving funding from the National Party this election cycle probably 20 times more than we've ever received before. The National Party has targeted 7 congressional seats, twice as many as any other state in the country. We have a full-time office of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee in Texas because of these big demographic changes. In 2018, we picked up 12 state house seats, right? Now, given the normal demographic trends, you would have thought most of those positions were Hispanics or African Americans. The great majority of members in the legislature today that are Democrats are either Hispanic or African American. Out of those 12 seats that we picked up, the majority of them were not Black or Hispanic. They were Anglos that were elected. Most of them, by the way, were women, but it was not the normal demographic group that we have depended upon in the past to win in elections. And the reason you saw that was because most of these victories occurred in suburbs. outside of Dallas, Fort Worth, that area, outside of Houston, outside of Travis County. I mean, at one point, for example, in Travis County in Austin, half the state reps were Republicans in this county, Travis County, that everybody considers to be the liberal bastion of the state. Well, now because of these changes in the suburbs, Williamson County, for example, would be considered a suburb. Georgetown of Travis County, we elected 2 state representatives in districts that we hadn't seen a Democrat in years. And in those counties, you're seeing more county commissioners getting elected, justices of peace. Same thing outside of Harris County, Fort Bend County. It's the best example I can give you. Fort Bend County is, I believe, the 7th largest county in the state of Texas. It's the home of Tom DeLay. Remember him? Tom DeLay was the Republican majority leader in Congress many years ago. He got indicted and then the charges were thrown out. And he ran that part of the state with an iron hand. We had not elected a single county-wide Democrat in that county in generations, right? The last election cycle, 2018, in Fort Bend County is a suburb of Harris County or of Houston. In fact, part of Houston includes Fort Bend County, right? City limits include Fort Bend County. This last election cycle, we won every single county-wide position in the county. And not only that, we elected an African-American district attorney and the first Indian American county judge in the history of the United States of America in this county. And so that's an example of a combination of demographic changes there. In that county, you did have a lot of people moving in from outside, but you have a large Indian American population, an Asian American population that has become that has moved into that area, but also become more politicized in the last few years. And so you've seen that county shift dramatically in the last 4 to 6 years. So, but you're seeing places like Collin County, Denton County, outside of Dallas-Fort Worth area that are turning more and more in the direction of the Democratic Party. There are numbers where we would lose those counties by 22, 23, 24%. We're down to, 2-4% nowadays. And gradually it's those counties, probably within the next 2, if not this election cycle, within the next 2 years, they'll be basically blue counties.
This makes every election cycle in Texas going forward an interesting to see how things are changing throughout the state. We've been listening to and talking to Chairman Gilberto Hinojosa of the Texas Democratic Party. I want to thank you for joining us today, and this is just so engaging and helpful for our listeners to get this perspective and to see what's happening throughout the state in the Democratic Party, especially too and this will be interesting to see. I know all eyes around the country and maybe even around the world will be on this virtual convention that will be held, I think, the first week in June, where the Texas Democrats will come together to choose their electors, their representatives to the national convention, and to set their platform. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
We're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back with more On Politics, so stay tuned.
T for Texas is a Texas-based history podcast from historian Dr. T. Lindsay Baker. Find a new episode every Thursday morning wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to On Politics. We are glad you're joining us today, and we want to wrap up the show looking back at the 2 interviews that we've had over these past 2 weeks. The one last week with James Dickey, the chairman of the Republican Party of Texas, and Gilberto Hinojosa, who is the chair of the Democratic Party of Texas, that we just interviewed on the first segment of the show today, and just really kind of bring this information that we've received together. And so I've got several points here that I just want to make in wrapping this up, and then really looking ahead at the election calendar and where we position all of this in relation both to Texas and the general election that will be on November 3rd. So one of the things that I think we see in these two interviews and the information we receive from the two chairmen are the conventions. We know the Democratic convention is going to be virtual. It's going to be in the first week in June. And so that's a unique thing because this is one of the largest political conventions in the country, if not in the world. And it'll be interesting to see how that works in a virtual platform. For the Republican Party, they've moved their convention to mid-July in Houston, and they're still planning a face-to-face event, of course, monitoring the pandemic and how it's impacting things as the state begins to open back up. So this will be very interesting contrast here to see how both parties address this in their conventions, especially in the midst of this crisis, as we discussed in both interviews. Also, I think one of the things that we see emphasized by both parties, and both chairmen mentioned this, is participation. The anticipation is that there will be a high voter turnout, the highest in the history of the state for a presidential election. Possibly 10 to 11 million voters will cast ballots in November, depending on the environment and the circumstances that are going on. And so this is going to be a challenge. It would be in a regular election cycle a challenge because that many people voting, especially in metropolitan areas where there are precincts where there would be lines and hours of waiting. And so they have two different strategies here. You see one with the Republican Party of we need more people, we possibly need more polling sites, we may need to put social distancing in place. The Democrats have made a move to try to push the state and influence the state to offer more options by mail. In addition to saying, yes, we're going to need more options on election day, including polling sites where people can go and vote in a timely manner. So the critical thing here, I think, is participation, is being ready, I think, prepared, all of us, is that there may need to be more people involved in just the election process and being willing to be election workers and being willing to look at what options you have in order to be able to cast your ballot. All of this is in flux and is going to the planning now is so critical to be ready for Election Day in November. And then if you look at this and the discussions with both chairmen, transition in Texas, both parties are preparing their platforms. They're putting those platforms together for the upcoming state legislature, which will meet beginning in January following the election. And this convention is a time for those platforms to be put together. We know that certainly the Republican Party platform is critical given the majority that they've had in both the House and Senate in the state. But that's changing. And as we talk with Chairman Hinojosa, we see that demographics in the suburbs and many places throughout the state are changing, and Democratic representation by people elected identifying with the Democratic Party, those numbers are increasing. They've been increasing very slowly, but at some point there's going to be more and more of an influence, and we'll be looking at that in this election and in the next legislative session. So these are some things to be watching in the months ahead as we look to the general election. Part of this is putting it within a timeline, not just for Texas, but nationally. As we move through the month of May, we have Nebraska, Oregon, Hawaii, Guam that have primaries that have been rescheduled or are scheduled. Looking into June, a number of states, Indiana, Maryland, Montana, New Mexico, and many others have their primaries scheduled. And then into June, also in June, Puerto Rico, Georgia, West Virginia, Kentucky, New York, just a lot of primaries, even though it seems like the presidential candidates are set for the general election. These primaries are going to be very critical. And then, of course, in August, we have both the Democratic National Convention in Milwaukee, which will be August 17th through 20th, and then the Republican National Convention, August 24th through 27th in Charlotte, North Carolina. The Democratic Convention was moved, but they are still planning face-to-face conventions in order to conduct the business of the parties and prepare for the general election. And then, of course, following that, we have 4 debates scheduled September into October. before the general election on November 3rd. So that kind of puts it from the point where we are now through the summer and into that general election cycle and wrapping it up at the general election. And I think these are things that we need to be watching as to how the parties adjust, both at the state level and at the national level, in order to conduct their business, to move this process forward toward our general election. And we'll be keeping you posted on this as we see changes and developments related to elections. But we want to thank you for joining us. You can access the interviews that we've had the last 2 weeks where you download podcasts or through SoundCloud. And I would encourage you to listen to those. They were good, extensive interviews that really look at the party process in Texas and how adjustments are being made in this current crisis. And then we'll be back here again next week at noon on Sunday, right here on 90.5 KTRL FM. And we will look forward to moving forward and discussing additional issues, not only related to the crisis, but following the election cycle, and hopefully turning to some other state, national, and international issues in the weeks ahead. Thank you for joining us.
This has been a Tarleton Radio Network podcast with production from AJ Heyer and Taylor Welch. Find more great shows by searching Tarleton Radio Network wherever you get your podcasts.